Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Neuroscience Computational, Wednesday, July 22. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a temptation, when you glance at the headlines coming out of computational neuroscience, to read the field as a kind of arms race, bigger models, larger datasets, sharper decoders, the steady conquest of the brain by machine learning. And there's truth in that picture. But if you sit with the actual work being done right now, a stranger and more interesting pattern comes into focus, one that a casual reader would almost certainly miss. It's this: the field has quietly stopped asking what the brain represents and started asking what the brain does. The center of gravity has shifted from structure to dynamics, from the snapshot to the trajectory. Let me make that concrete, because it's the thread I want to pull all the way through the hour. Consider a study of everyday human movement, 16 ordinary activities, walking, waving, whatever it might be, that asked a deceptively simple question. What information in a moving body lets us recognize what someone is doing? And the answer split cleanly in two. To classify an action, to name it, you mostly need posture. A single frozen pose carries the label. But to reconstruct the action, to regenerate it faithfully, to know how it unfolds, you need motion. You need the whole temporal arc. That's not a footnote. That's the entire epistemology of the field in miniature. A static description tells you what category something belongs to, only the dynamics tell you what it actually is. Now watch that same distinction surface, unbidden, in a completely different corner of the discipline. There's a body of work on what happens when a neural network goes entirely silent, every neuron quiet, no persistent activity at all. The old assumption was that silence means the information is gone. If nothing is firing, nothing is being held. But it turns out the network can spontaneously reignite, regenerate a whole new cycle of activity from nothing, because the memory was never in the firing at all. It was hidden in the synapses, in a transient configuration of connection strengths. The state you can measure had vanished. The disposition to act had not. Once again, the static snapshot is silent, and the dynamics carry the truth. You begin to see why I called this the non-obvious cross-cutting insight. These are researchers who have never spoken to one another, working on movement perception and on abstract network models, and they are converging on the same claim. The meaningful thing is not the position in state space, it's the flow through it. And this is why, if you look at the most ambitious theoretical work right now, you find people reaching for the mathematics of dynamical systems rather than the mathematics of representation. There's an effort to model motor cortex as what physicists call a port-Hamiltonian system, a conservative core of coupled oscillators plus a leaky port that bleeds energy away, and to show it sits poised at criticality, that knife edge where the brain seems to like to live. There's a subtle and rather deep argument about how you even compare two such systems, whether two brains or brain and a model are doing the same computation despite wearing different coordinates. The naive answer is, rotate one until it lines up with the other. The sharper answer is that alignment of that kind is neither necessary nor sufficient. What you actually want is topological conjugacy, a correspondence between the shapes of the flows themselves. That is a field maturing. It has stopped trusting surface resemblance and started asking about deep structural sameness. Layer onto this, the way meditation of all things is now being modeled as a journey through four attractor states, breath focus giving way to mind wandering, caught by meta-awareness, redirected, around and around, and you realize the reach of this idea. Even the wandering mind is being treated as a dynamical object, a set of basins and the transitions between them. Attention itself becomes a trajectory, so here is the argument I want to build over the coming stretch. Point 1, which I've just laid before you, the field has crossed a threshold, from a science of what the brain contains to a science of how the brain moves. That's the state of play. But it raises a hard question, and it's the question I want to hold us to. If dynamics are what matter, then a very old and comfortable program dimensionality reduction, finding the low-dimensional manifold, drawing the tidy picture, comes under real pressure. Is that low-dimensional structure a genuine causal actor in the brain's computation, or merely a shadow we cast on the data for our own comfort? There's fascinating work suggesting an information bottleneck, forcing a network into a low-dimensional representation, is actually necessary for it to generalize, that the compression isn't decorative, it's load-bearing. That's the tension I want to sit inside. Not whether the brain has low-dimensional dynamics, it plainly does, but whether we've earned the right to say those dynamics do the work, or whether we're still admiring our own reflection. Let's find out. There's a temptation, when you survey a field's weekly output, to see only a scatter of unrelated cleverness. Somebody builds a fall detector for the elderly, somebody else charts the topology of dreaming brains, a third team models a meditator drifting between breath and reverie. On the surface, nothing binds them. But listen for a while and you begin to hear a single tide moving underneath all the local weather, and I want to try to name it. The deep current is this: neuroscience has quietly stopped asking what the brain contains and started asking what the brain is doing moment to moment, as a system evolving in time. The unit of explanation has shifted from the snapshot to the trajectory, and once you notice this, you cannot unnotice it. Consider the humble question of how we recognize a person walking. You might have supposed the answer lies in posture, the arrangement of limbs frozen at an instant, a static shape to be classified. And indeed, if all you want is to name the activity, posture will serve. But if you want to reconstruct the movement, to regenerate it faithfully, posture is not enough. You need motion, the smooth, temporally extended flow of joints through time, captured by things like temporally continuous primitives or polynomial bases that treat a movement as a curve rather than a collection of points. That distinction, recognition versus reconstruction, the pose versus the path, is a miniature of the whole shift. To classify, you can get away with a still image. To understand, you must follow the trajectory. The same logic surfaces where you'd least expect it. Take the problem of detecting a fall. The naive approach treats it as pose matching. Is this shape a fallen over shape? But a fall is not a pose. A fall is a stability loss event in a coupled dynamical system, the center of mass parting company with the base of support, inertia and ground contact wrestling in continuous time. Reframe it as dynamics and suddenly you have something physically interpretable, something with adaptive time constants that reads instability as it unfolds rather than after the body has hit the floor. The physics was always the point. The pose was a shadow of it. And once time and dynamics become the currency, the borrowed language changes too. We start hearing the brain described in the vocabulary of physics proper. Motor cortex modeled as a port-Hamiltonian system, a conservative core of coupled oscillators bleeding energy through a dissipative port, poised near criticality, showing that telltale 1/f spectrum and long-range correlation that mark a system balanced on the edge of order. Or consciousness itself sketched as a landscape of potential wells, sensory input carving a complex-valued terrain down which high-level representations roll toward conscious access. These are not idle metaphors. They are claims that the brain's behavior obeys the grammar of dynamical systems, attractors, flows, energy, stability, and that if we write the equations properly, the phenomenology falls out. Look at the meditation work in this light. Here is subjective experience, breath focus, the mind wandering off, the little jolt of meta-awareness, the deliberate redirection rendered as a traversal between attractor states, 4 basins, and a life lived in the movement between them. The high-dimensional neural substrate churns away as a stochastic process over attention networks. A lower-dimensional generative model reads out what's happening. A metacognitive monitor sits above, noticing the drift and steering. It is a dynamical portrait of a wandering mind. The insight is not that meditation involves such and such a region, but that it is a shape of motion through a space of possible mental states. Even memory, which we habitually imagine as storage, a thing held, a value written down, is being reconceived as latent dynamics. There is elegant work showing that a network can fall completely silent, every neuron quiet, and yet the future is already decided. Not by any persistent firing, but by a hidden configuration in the synapses, a residual pattern that determines whether the whole thing sputters out or spontaneously reignites into another cycle of activity. The information was never in the activity. It was in the structure poised to generate activity. That is as pure a statement of the deep current as one could ask for. What matters is not the state, but the disposition, not the picture, but the propensity to move. And notice how this reframing pays its way. When researchers force an artificial network through a genuine information bottleneck, compelling it toward a low-dimensional representation, it doesn't merely become tidier, it generalizes. It handles rotations, copes with data it was never shown. The low-dimensional dynamical structure is not decoration, it is what makes the system work. Which is precisely the argument the neural manifold people have been pressing. Those low-dimensional flows underlying high-dimensional firing are load-bearing, not epiphenomenal. So the current runs from posture to motion, from state to trajectory, from what is stored to what is disposed. The brain, increasingly, is not a thing we photograph. It is a river we must learn to read. There's a temptation, when surveying a field as busy as this one, to read the sheer variety as noise, 100 groups pulling in 100 directions. I'd resist that. What I hear underneath the racket is a single argument being conducted in many dialects, and it's worth naming the argument plainly because it changes what you should watch for next. The argument is this: neuroscience is quietly abandoning the idea that a brain state is a snapshot and replacing it with the idea that a brain state is a trajectory. That sounds like a small semantic shift. It is not. It reorganizes what counts as an explanation. Consider the work on activity regenerating itself from silence. The striking claim there is that a network can fall completely quiet, no neurons firing at all, and yet the residual configuration of the synapses already contains enough information to determine whether the whole thing will reignite or stay dark. The memory isn't in the activity. The memory is in the hidden state that persists after the activity is gone. Now hold that beside the finding that classifying a daily movement needs only posture, but reconstructing it needs motion. Two different research communities, and yet the same lesson. The informative thing and the dynamical thing are not the same thing. You can recognize what someone is doing from a frozen pose, but you cannot rebuild the doing of it without the flow. Structure tells you what, only the trajectory tells you how. Once you notice that pattern, you see it everywhere in this material. The fall detection people recast falling not as a bad pose to be spotted, but as a stability loss event in a coupled dynamical system center of mass, drifting away from base of support, in real time, on a low-power chip. The motor cortex modelers treat the brain during a movement task as a physical system with conservation and dissipation built in, complete with a noise channel calibrated to body temperature. Even the meditation work, which one might expect to be the softest, most metaphorical corner of the room, commits fully to trajectory language, attention as a wandering path across four attractor states, breath focus, mind-wandering, meta-awareness, and the deliberate act of redirecting. The mind is not in a state. The mind is moving between states, and expertise is a property of how it moves. So here is the second-order implication, and it's the one I'd ask you to carry away. If the object of study is a trajectory rather than a snapshot, then the deep question stops being, what does this brain represent? And becomes, when are two systems doing the same thing? And that question turns out to be genuinely hard in a way that should make us humble. There is beautiful, austere work here showing that aligning two dynamical systems by rotating one onto the other orthogonal alignment, the natural first guess, is neither necessary nor sufficient to establish that they compute the same thing. Two systems can be genuinely equivalent and still resist being lined up by any such tidy transformation. Sameness of computation is a subtler relation than sameness of coordinates. That is not an obscure technical footnote. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire enterprise. Every ambition in this field, decoding across different people's brains, comparing a biological circuit to its artificial imitation, asking whether a meditator's calm resembles a drug's calm, depends on a defensible answer to, are these two dynamics the same? And we are only now discovering how easy it is to get that comparison wrong, to declare a match because two things rhymed in coordinates rather than agreeing in structure. What should you watch for then? 3 things. First, watch whether the trajectory view earns its keep by making predictions. The snapshot view, cannot the reignition from silence result, is the model of what that looks like. A genuinely counterintuitive claim about hidden state that you could go and test. Second, watch the grounding question. There's an argument running through this material that biological intelligence builds its world model through action first and attaches language afterwards, whereas our machines have been doing it backwards, language first, everything else bolted on. If that's right, embodiment isn't a feature to add later, it's the scaffold the whole thing hangs from, and the systems that keep learning in the field will force us to govern individuals rather than models. Third, and most quietly, watch the humility. The best work here is increasingly honest about how much it doesn't know, imputation-free models that refuse to invent missing data, comparison methods that admit alignment can mislead. That last instinct is the healthiest signal in the whole survey. A field that has learned to distrust its own easy comparisons is a field that has grown up. The trajectory has replaced the snapshot. Now the task is to compare trajectories without fooling ourselves. Get that right and everything downstream, the decoders, the therapies, the machines that learn stands on firmer ground. Get it wrong, and we will spend a decade mistaking a rhyme for a reason. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.